Welcome back to my channel. I'm currently reviewing zoom lenses for medium format camera systems. And the one I already reviewed and posted on my channel was the 32-64 GF lens for the Fujifilm GFX medium format camera system. And there is another one coming on the 45-100mm GF lens, also on the GFX 100S. But of course, if looking at medium format zoom lenses, the Hasselblad X1D cannot be missed. And here we have the Hasselblad X1D Mark II. The zoom lens I'm using is the 35-75mm zoom lens from Hasselblad, so it's an XCD lens. It's an excellent lens. I'm going to provide my review in this video and share, of course, also lots of sample images. And now let's kick off the video. I want to kick off my review with a general remark I already made when reviewing the Fuji GF 32-64mm lens, and the remark is the following. Generally, I'm a prime lens shooter. I shoot prime lenses much more often than I shoot zoom lenses, and a rule of thumb also says that prime lenses will in general provide the better image quality. But be careful if you make that statement on the Hasselblad X system or the Fuji GFX system, because first of all, you pay a lot for these zoom lenses, but they also give you a lot of quality. And my personal experience is that at the different focal length you can choose here, on that zoom lens for instance from Hasselblad, you get about the same image quality as if you would shoot with a prime lens. It's not a totally true statement, because if you really crop in deeply into your images, you see a difference, but it gives you sufficient image quality and sufficient reserves based on a 50 megapixel sensor to safely work with that zoom lens, in particular if you go for fashion and beauty, which is the special topic of this video when it comes to sample images. Let's start with a few general data points on this lens. And first of all, since we have a crop factor of 0.79 to convert images in terms of focal length from the Hasselblad X1D Mark II into a full frame equivalent setup, we are talking about the correspondence of the 35mm on this lens to be a 28mm focal length on a full frame equivalent. And if we look at the 75mm and apply the crop factor of 0.79, we end up at about 60mm. So in a full frame equivalent camera setup, you would actually talk here about 28mm as a starting point, and it ends at about 60mm, which covers a huge range of photographic situations. On the 28mm, here it's the 35, you would talk about typical landscape, architecture, cities and all of that. And at the 75mm, which is in full frame terminology is 60mm, you are just 10mm beyond a normal focal length, which is very good for portraits and all kinds of street photography. Sharing a few more data points on the lens, the weight of the lens is substantial. So we are talking about 1115 gram. The filter size here, if you look at the front of the camera, is 77mm, which is not unusual for a zoom lens for a medium format camera, of course. And the angle of view at the wide angle setting, so 35mm on the X camera system, is 77 degrees, and it narrows down at 75mm to 41 degrees, which is a bit more narrow than the usual 50mm normal focal length you have on full frame equivalent setups. And I think that's in line with what I said before about the full frame equivalent focal length corresponding to 35 and 75mm. We have a minimum shooting distance towards a subject of 0.6 meters, and according to the spec sheet, this is the same independent of whether we shoot at 35 or 75mm. We also have a maximum reproduction ratio of 1 divided by 8.5 in the wide angle setting, and 1 divided by 6.5, so actually higher of course at the tele setting 75mm, which is the 60mm and a full frame equivalent. And that means based on the crop reserves we have on a 50 megapixel sensor, you can actually use that camera in combination with that lens also for close-up type situations. The optical construction of the zoom lens here is quite complex. We talk about 15 elements in 13 groups, and we have 2 aspherical elements, which all in actually speaks for the quality we expect this lens to deliver, of course. The shooting experience with that zoom lens on the Hasselblad X1D Mark II, but also on the 2 other compatible Hasselblad X system cameras, is a very pleasant one, but there is some shadow in a lot of light, and I wanted to share my impressions, of course. First of all, the build quality of the lens is terrific. I think the zoom ring, if you turn it, has a lot of resistance compared to other zoom rings on other zoom lenses, and you will not accidentally turn this to a focal length where you not wanted to end up with. The focus ring is also very smooth, and if the camera is turned on, but you would not be able to hear it here in my recording, is buttery smooth but has these tiny little clicks, which actually makes it such a nice experience to manually focus these type of XCD lenses. The lens itself is fully weather sealed in the same way as the camera body here, and you can shoot this under rough conditions outside. You will have absolutely no problems. The only caveat I need to make when praising this zoom lens here, and also that's the reason why I said there is some shadow in a lot of light, is still the autofocus. And I mentioned this several times when I reviewed Hasselblad X cameras in combination with XCD lenses. The autofocus is just too slow for my taste. And let's have a look at that here. Let's try to focus a little bit here. This worked. But it takes a while, you know, and the Fuji GFX system is just much quicker, as I demonstrated several times on my channel. And it finds focus. What I should say, on the flip side of the coin, whenever the camera finds focus, it sits exactly where you want it to sit based on that autofocus field here in the camera. But it is just very slow. And one workaround, if you are not patient enough, is to go to manual focus. Then your focus peaking will kick in. And based on these before mentioned tiny little clicks you have in the focus ring here, you will not be able to hear them in my recording, but they are there, and every Hasselblad shooter on the X system knows what I'm talking about. That makes manual focus just a really pleasant experience. And since I shoot Leica M series cameras very often, I'm very familiar with manual focusing, and I don't mind using manual focus. But if you rely on autofocus, it is just super slow compared to other camera systems. And one reason is that the Hasselblad X camera system relies on contrast detection only and does not have phase detection like you find it, for instance, in the Fuji GFX camera series. But that's the only complaint I have. That's the only reason why I said there is some shadow in a lot of light. Otherwise, this lens is performing in terrific ways, in particular on the X1D Mark II. And I want to move on now to sample images. As a main topic for this video, I want to show sample images from a shooting in a very fancy hotel here in Switzerland, but I also want to provide other sample images based on landscape and, you know, just playing around with the lens and giving you some impressions what the lens is capable of. What I should mention as a side remark is that I'm generally a natural and available light shooter, so I don't like flashes, but for my shooting in that hotel in Switzerland, I used from time to time a flash on the X1D Mark II, and the one I used is the Nikon Speedlight SB5000. And you should know that the hot shoe from Nikon is compatible with the hot shoe from the Hasselblad X camera system. And you can just take it out of the box, insert the batteries here, it will work immediately, the camera will detect it. I had absolutely no trouble setting this up and using it, and the flash was working just in a very nice synchronized way with the camera and the light I had available in my particular shooting situations. The hotel is embedded into the Swiss mountains around Lake Lucerne, and the weather was, to be quite frank, very hazy and not the way I had planned for. One good recipe against hazy weather is, besides the fact that there is a dehazing slider in Lightroom, to start with some exposure bracketing. On the Hasselblad X1D Mark II, I went for 7 frames and had full stops of difference between the frames and then compiled them later in Lightroom. Despite the fact that the weather was very hazy and not the way I had planned for, the cloud formations in the sky were nevertheless quite impressive. So I decided to go for a time-lapse video and actually use the intervalometer in the X1D Mark II with 5 seconds of interval distance between the consecutive frames, and then post-process this in Final Cut Pro into an 8K time-lapse, which I then can scale down at my convenience later on in Premiere Pro, for instance at 4K, to produce it at YouTube. As said when we spoke about the focal length this lens has to offer, it covers a broad spectrum and all kinds of different photographic situations. And I should actually mention that the widest open aperture of f3.5 in the wide angle setting, but in the tele setting at 4.5 nevertheless allows for a shallow depth of field and a nice depth in the images if you get it right. The magnification of the lens in combination with the crop reserves you have in 50 megapixel images, you can also get close-up type shots like here in that image easily done with that lens mounted on the Hasselblad X1D Mark II. In the wide angle setting, as mentioned before, 35mm on the XCD lens corresponds to 28mm in a full frame equivalent setup. You actually have a very nice instrument for landscape photography. And here are a few sample images which I took around the lake. And I think in general, the image quality, the color rendering, like always with the Hasselblad X camera system, but also the sharpness, the overall quality is just absolutely nice. And I like a lot what I'm seeing here. Zoom lenses like the one I'm reviewing here are ideal for beauty and fashion shootings. And we had booked a hotel room for the shooting, and it requires careful planning to get it right. So the job was to shoot different outfits, different situations. I also clearly wanted to incorporate the view, the balcony, the furniture in the hotel room. And let's look into the sample images now and then also provide some comments on the image quality, of course.
I think I like it. I think I like it. Got nothing to lose. 'Cause I think I like it. Tell me if you like me
At the end of the video, I want to comment on a few particular images here and provide some additional commentary on what I like about this lens. And this is a first image I wanted to look into more detail. It's a 75mm shot and it's an f4.5, which is widest open, all you can get at 75mm, but it has a nice background blurriness and it's in particular very sharp. You see that on the face. It's a portrait type situation, and that's why I said for fashion and beauty, if you want to go with one lens, it's an ideal lens because you get a portrait setup on the focal length like 75mm here. You can use it for, let's say, wide angle shots in a hotel room. It's just an ideal lens for fashion and beauty. I took a lot of images on that particular day, and there is another image I wanted to show here, which is not from the beauty shooting, but on landscape. And you saw this quickly before, but what always fascinates me with the Hasselblad X system is the color rendering and the way the sensor in combination with the XCD lenses represents light. And this is a very nice shot, I think. From the image composition, it's shot at 35mm, so in the wide angle setting, typical for landscape. As I said before, 28mm in a full frame equivalent. I closed the aperture quite significantly to an f14 here to get a maximum depth of field here, and it's shot at 1/100 seconds and an ISO of 200. And first of all, on the sharpness of the image, absolutely nothing to complain. If you look at the clock at the church tower here, but also at the mountains in the background, you get so much detail. It's so crisp and sharp, And clearly, if you find someone who loves that particular area in Switzerland, you can easily sell that image for a good price, and that person will get it on the wall in a large print dimension. What I also already mentioned is that the magnification ratio in combination with the 50 megapixel on the sensor is good enough for close-up type situations. If you look at that image here, first of all at the flower, it's incredibly sharp, and I didn't use the sharpness slider here in Lightroom. This is a 200% crop, and you see the bees on the flowers are also super sharp. So also here you get a wide range of options in terms of different shooting situations you can cover with that lens on the X1D Mark II. Here's another image I wanted to show, and that is an image which was shot at 50mm f8.0. Still you get some background blurriness here based on the short distance I had to the model, 1/180 seconds and an ISO of 100. And I think that flex, shooting not only at 35 or shooting with a 75mm lens, but having a 50mm in between, like you get it on that zoom lens, that is very convenient. And talking maybe one last time about sharpness, it's also a very sharp image. You get so much detail in the face, on the hair, and I think the way the lens transports the light to the sensor and preserves all the tiny little details in the scene is just absolutely amazing here. Maybe spending a moment on image composition here. This is an image where I tried to incorporate maximum symmetry. It didn't fully work. You see this on the pillows here. You have a bit more pillow here on the right hand side, and on the left hand side it's a bit cut off. On the background the same. You see a lot of symmetry, but it's not a perfect symmetry. But I think that also makes up the character of that particular image. And incorporating elements in the shooting based on the furniture and the way the hotel room was set up is something I personally like a lot when I go for fashion and beauty. And here you have, for instance, the reflections of the background, the outside world with the sky in the mirror at the background of the image. And that is something I think should be incorporated in a shooting. Here in this particular situation, I was shooting with 60mm, and clearly here you see the advantage of having the flex of a zoom lens. If I would have had a 35mm lens for the hotel shooting and for portraits a 75mm, I would not have had the flex to go for 60mm, and I needed a 60mm to capture exactly that scene with the symmetry and the image composition in the way it appears here. Last but not least, maybe one more image with a landscape situation here. So this one was again shot at 35mm with an aperture of f8, 1/250 seconds, an ISO of 100. And what I wanted to show here is again the amount of detail you get in these images. This is just fantastic. And that's why I also dared to make that statement at the beginning that this zoom lens at any focal length is almost as good as a corresponding prime lens, because you get so much detail in these images. The resolution capacity of the lens towards the sensor, if you look at the tiny little houses here, for instance, is so amazing that you will not miss your prime lens. You can just go with the zoom lens, enjoy your shooting, and the image quality will reward you at the very end with a high level of details, nice color rendering, and everything you were aiming for. I hope my video and review provided some useful data points for you, and as I said, prime lens shooting is typically superior. But if you go for fashion and beauty, shooting sometimes with zoom lenses, in particular as I did in a hotel, gives you some additional flex. And if you're looking for a very good zoom lens for the Hasselblad X camera system, this might be the right choice for you. For me, it's definitely the right choice. I really enjoyed shooting with that lens. And I think also the images and footage coming out of that combination, the X1D Mark II with the 35-75mm XCD zoom lens, they are really good and I really like them. If you liked that video, don't forget to drop me your thumbs up. Stay tuned on my channel, there's always more to come. Stay safe and healthy, and of course, peace out.